again. We're going to get started with our first panel. So if I could invite my panelists to join me here at the front, and I'll introduce you to them briefly. Tracy is a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania. She received her law degree from Temple University School of Law, and she has been working to advance women's rights for the past 30 years. She is the executive director of the Women's Law Project, based here in Philadelphia, a public interest law center that advocates for women through high-impact litigation, policy development, public education, and systems reform. Ms. Tracy has presided over major legal victories with national impact in the areas of reproductive rights and has led major advocacy efforts to reform law enforcement and judicial response to sexual and domestic violence in Philadelphia. Next to her, we have Soraya Chemaly, who is a feminist writer, media critic, and activist whose work focuses on women's rights and the role of gender in politics, religion, and popular culture. She has contributed to places like Salon, The Huffington Post, The Guardian, Ms. Magazine, and CNN, and has been a commentator for Al Jazeera, the BBC, the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation, Voice of Russia, and she has appeared on NPR's Voice of the Nation. Most recently, she was one of the primary organizers of a successful social media campaign demanding that Facebook recognize misogynistic content as hate speech. Ms. Chemaly returned to feminist activism and writing after a professional career in strategic planning and business development in the media, data, and technology fields. Before we get started with our panelists and their questions, I just want to know if people have the handout that was being given out as you came in. We're going to start. I know that you guys all came back to law school, to take a test. So we're going to start with that. If you'll just look over it, take a couple minutes to read over it, and then I'm going to ask people to answer. So we'll just answer by raising our hands. We'll do a show of hands. So for the first statement on this handout, who thinks that it's true? Who thinks that it's false? Okay. How about number 2? True? Okay, false? Number 3. Do you need a second to read it? It's longer. True? False? Number 4. True? False? 5. True? It's like all this started happening here on this one. False? Number 6. True? False? 7. True? False? Maybe my panelists shouldn't answer. 8. True? False? Number 9. True? False? Number 10. I think that's true? False. Okay, so ready for your grade? They're all true. Okay, they're all true. And after the symposium, I will send out email with the answer sheet with the references for all of that data, all right? So let's get started with our panelists. That's just to set the stage for the range of ways that sexism affects our lives today. To set the stage for our discussion, I'm going to ask my panelists to share with us how they came to their work advocating for women's rights and the significance that it holds for them personally. Carol, would you share with us about how you came to work advocating for women's rights?
Well, I'm frequently asked this question, and many times on panels, and the other panelists have much loftier explanations than I do. Mine began with Elvis. I got thrown out of Catholic school in 6th grade, or my Catholic classroom, in 6th grade because I liked Elvis. Yeah. So it meant that I stood up to Sister Ida Marie, But it also meant that when she came back to the parish when I was in high school, she apologized. And I always saw that as my first institutional confrontation that was successful. And of course, given that particular institution, it was the last of my confrontations that were successful. I graduated from high school in the year in 1964 when the Civil Rights Act was passed. And at that time, there were very few opportunities for women. I did not want to become a librarian. I didn't want to become a nurse. I didn't want to become a social worker. So I became a secretary. And some of my additional feminist underpinnings resulted from being fired from a few jobs. The first one was when I told my boss that a secretary had more to do than to get him coffee. Out the door I went. And the second I wasn't fired from, but it was quite clearly, for me, I was not welcome in this insurance company, and it was actually owned by my cousin, because I went there after I'd gotten fired from the other job. And it was the Monday after Martin Luther King had been assassinated. This was an insurance company that also did bail bonds work. And I just said, can I go out early? A memorial procession is forming. I'd like to take my lunch hour. And they said, yeah, but if you get arrested, don't come to us for bail. So I moved away from there. Eventually, I got a job here at Penn as a secretary because I wanted to go to night school. And shortly thereafter, it became quite apparent that there was a community of scholars, and they consisted of faculty and students, and people like me were not terribly involved, and I started union organizing. And our cafeteria workers were also union organizing, and they were so underpaid at the time that they were eligible for welfare. So I was in the city planning department where that was the hotbed of student activism. This is the anti-war period. So I brought together the unions and the students, and we shut down Penn. At that time, women faculty, I'll end this quickly, women faculty were also organizing, and I went to them and saying, you can't exclude us, and they didn't. And they became my mentors and helped me go back to undergraduate school. And as an undergraduate, I started taking women's studies courses. And the next pivotal thing that happened to me was 1973, when 2 student nurses were gang raped right around the block. And the director of public safety told women the way to prevent rape was to not wear provocative clothing. So we organized a sit-in and held College Hall for 5 days and brought about the kinds of changes that are under discussion now. So that's how my feminism began. And the women's studies courses that I took at Penn, I had the privilege of studying with people like Carol Smith Rosenberg, the noted historian, and Janice Madden, the economist. And that really gave me the intellectual background to support the activist nature that was obviously part of my DNA.
So I had fairly similar experiences in terms of what I would call institutional hypocrisy. But I would say that I came to this work very early as a child. My first sense, not kidding, was when I was 5, and I was dancing with my best friend, who was a Haitian boy, and I grew up in the Bahamas, a very mixed polyethnic background, and my grandfather, who was English, called me aside and said, you can't do that. And it was really incoherent, and the reason he said it in my brain was that white girls, and I'm white there, even if I'm not white here, don't dance that way. And I thought, well, that's just stupid, right? And I checked it in my brain and disregarded him. But I was 5. The second thing that struck me was, I call them the 4 Ds. There was the dancing, the dishes, the damsels, and the deceit. The second thing that struck me was this notion of narrative. So I had a great-grandmother who I was always told she was very beautiful, and that was characterized because she was Jordanian by being fair. She had fair skin and light eyes. And so when she was 14, my great-grandfather, who was 21, swept into her village, pulled her on his horse, rode away with her into the sunset, and then years later they had 7 children and had moved across the world. And when I heard this when I was 5, I was like, oh, a princess story. When I heard it when I was 11, which was 2 years after the first time I was threatened with rape, I said to everyone sitting in the room, and it was my whole family, loud, noisy family, and I said, well, you know, I really think that my great-grandfather, who everybody loves, he was a lovely person, should go to jail. Because indeed he had kidnapped and raped her, traumatized her for the rest of her life, isolated her from her family, which is why, as a 50-year-old woman, she was actually incapable of speech. And that's when I got my first feminist pat on the head. I was like, that's so cute, right? And I'm looking around and I'm thinking, I'm not a lunatic. This is what the man did, right? So I was a very faithful person, and like you, I think, in the church, I was the kind of kid who read the missals from front to back and took them home. And so I wanted to be a priest. And so I said, I'm going to be a priest. And my dad said, we were in the car on the way to church, and he said, well, you can't be a priest. That's funny. And he laughed. And I said, well, why can't I be a priest? And he goes, well, girls aren't priests. And I said, why? And he said, well, why don't you talk to the priest, who was an alcoholic and always drunk in church. So I thought, that's not going to really help me, but whatever, I'll do that. And I went and I spoke to him, and at the end of the conversation, I said, so you're really telling me that because men have penises, they get to be priests? And he was pretty much like, yeah. So I got back in the car and I said, I'm not going to church anymore because it's not for me. And the fourth thing was all those things put together, because I really felt that all of that was not just unpalatable to me as an individual, but unjust systemically. And so by the time I got to university, I started being a very vocal activist. I started a women's journal at Georgetown University, because in 1984 we couldn't really call it a feminist magazine, because I was insisting that they fund it as an institutional investment the way they funded everything else. And that took 2 years. And it was not a welcome thing on campus, you can imagine. We had a community that wanted to do this, but it was a fairly hostile environment. Then I went away, had to earn money, went through an intense kind of career period, and then I had 3 children under the age of 3, which was like being hit by a bus for about 3 years, which I really can't remember. And when my oldest child, who was 13, who's super tall, she's 5'8", she was in her soccer uniform, very young person in her sensibility at that point. She asked me if she could go for a walk. She wanted to go get some ice cream by herself. We live in a city. And I was overcome with profound sadness, because then I thought, oh my God, I have to talk to her about street harassment and rape, because she looks like she's 18 and she's very pretty and she's going to get that kind of attention. And she's an adventurous person with a good sense of self, but I have to be realistic about her learning how to assess risk in public spaces, which for us was a more realistic harm than in the home, which is not the case actually, right? And then I said to my husband, I'm quitting my job, and you know, we've invested all of this time, and I've worked in this way for a long time, but I'm going to just go back to feminist activism. I'm going to write every single day about girls and women's rights. And so that's what I've been doing for 2 years.
Thank you very much for sharing that with us. It's very interesting. You know, my mother also wanted to be a priest.
Yes, there are a lot
And
of us out there.
Thankfully, I never did.
You got out before. You're like, I'm out of here.
More common than I thought. As you know, this panel is supposed to address the way that sexism affects our lives in our communities, to look at it intimately, and to try and think about ways that we can respond and change these structures about which we've been talking. And so my next question to my panelists is in that vein. Carol, could you first please share with us the realities of sexism and gender oppression that your work confronts? And then tell us about the responses that you're a part of, including any avenues for change that those of us listening today can also become involved in.
That's a big question.
It's
But
a
you
big-
gave it
and
to us
you
in
have
advance,
plenty
right?
of time.
Before I begin, though, I would just like to say it's an honor for me to be here. I have participated in other Sparrow conferences. I met Ed Sparrow when I was the director of the Women's Center at Penn before I went to law school, and probably while I was at law school because I went part-time. I was working on affirmative action and tenure cases, and someone said, "You've got to meet this law professor." And I thought, I didn't really know who he was in the larger sense of the word, but I spent an afternoon with him, and it was just an amazing afternoon. He was so generous, he was so smart, he was so kind. And it was afterwards that I learned what a giant he was, and he died shortly after that. It was the only time I ever had the privilege of meeting with him, but indeed it was a privilege. And I'd also like to thank the law school for the wonderful externs that it sends to the Women's Law Project. So I gave you a little bit of my history, but I want to put that history first in a little bit of context for where we are today, because there was a remarkable decade between 1963 and 1973. In 1963, the Equal Pay Act was enacted. In 1964, Title VII to the Civil Rights Act was enacted that prohibited discrimination in employment. What lots of people don't know is sex was added to Title VII as a measure to try to defeat it, because it seems such a ludicrous idea. 1965, the birth control pill was on the market. 1965, Griswold was decided to invalidate statutes prohibiting the distribution of contraception. 1972, Title IX was enacted that just blew open the gates of educational institutions, where one or two women were in law school, medical school, business schools. That just blew that open. And of course, in 1973, it was Roe v. Wade. So and this is the decade in which I grew up. I came of age during this decade. So it was a time of, enormous social upheaval, and the landscape of opportunity changed for women in the way it never had changed in history. So since that time, we have been working to, and I think we said in my bio that I've been doing this for 30 years. It's more like 40 years. It was probably an old bio I gave. Since that time, people like me have been fighting to implement the laws. We've been fighting to advance where gaps are in the laws. And most recently, we've really been fighting to maintain the legal rights that we've gotten, because I think most of us know if any of this legislation was before our current Congress, the likelihood is it wouldn't pass, and we're not quite sure where the court's going to be, particularly on reproductive rights issues. The Women's Law Project has been to the Supreme Court 3 times on reproductive rights issues. Planned Parenthood versus Casey was our case. We continue to work on those issues. So before I go into some of that, what I think is important to think about in terms of are women's rights still relevant and important is the issues that are sort of beyond the fairness issues. Equality means fairness, of course, but what are the manifestations of the thousands of years of cultural bias and inequality that we see and continue to see? One example we found around 15 years ago was we exposed insurance companies who were either refusing to insure battered women or canceling their insurance because they placed them in an underwriting category along with people like parachutists, because the insurers determined that battered women voluntarily engaged in dangerous lifestyles. So we exposed that because someone came to us who couldn't get insurance. and she had something in her medical records. Now, the laws have changed. We've been active for 40 or 15 years in 48 states, and so. But I'm trying to explain that to understand the ways that you would be surprised in really understanding this. We found, it's sort of a spoiler on the questions, that even though there had been a tremendous amount of activity around sexual and domestic violence, in that decade I talked about and subsequent to that, a decade that was or a period of time that was very interesting because there was no Facebook, there was no social media. Women in communities all over the United States were gathering to deal with issues of sexual and domestic violence and developing ideas and strategies to change. The changes didn't come from legislators or district attorneys or police or even medical people, because women were really mistreated in emergency rooms who were sexually assaulted as well. It was a zeitgeist. It was something that was really happening throughout cities throughout the United States and throughout the world. And the change that was demanded was quite extraordinary, and there were significant changes in laws and institutions. But underneath it all, we see this kind of bias, as in the insurance companies. And then we found that the police in Philadelphia were not investigating sex crimes. That's something that's commonplace throughout the country. The police response to sex crimes, prosecutors' response to sex crimes is really terrible. And we have no data to really, really help us measure that. And then the other area around how inequality manifests itself is in healthcare. You'll hear from Marcia Greenberger at lunch today, but her organization and several other organizations do report cards and studies on women's health and well-being status. And Pennsylvania keeps getting very low or failing grades. The Law Center's most recent report card showed that Pennsylvania ranked 32 out of 50 states on major healthcare measures. And in areas like death from breast cancer, 44. But other issues like obesity, hypertension, diabetes, heart disease, just really terrible, terrible scores. So we sat at the Law Project and thought, why? And we wrote a report that I have with me. It's on our website. I don't have any more of them, called Through the Lens of Equality, where we looked at the environmental factors in women's lives. We looked at sexual and domestic violence. We looked at caregiving responsibilities. We looked at sexual harassment in employment and on college campuses. We looked at lack of access to athletics, Title IX issues for women. We looked at caregiving responsibilities, and we looked at insurance discrimination. And in all of those areas, what we found was a very strong correlation with other very significant health problems. Beyond the injuries, for example, that come from sexual assault and domestic violence, the other health consequences for people who experience that are gastrointestinal problems, hypertension, heart disease, and throughout all of these issues, we thought, well, that's the price of inequality. That's the cost that comes from the continuing social and cultural bias against women. And after discovering all of this, we also felt that it was important for us to develop some remedies for it, including legislative remedies. We find, for example, that there are still gaps in laws affecting pregnant women in the workplace. And actually, we have seen in our office an uptick in complaints. I think Amal Bass was here the other day on the sexual assault panel that you did. She's our lawyer who is spending most of her time dealing with clients, mostly low-income women, in jobs where they're getting fired because they need a stool to sit on at various times, they need a bathroom break, they need to drink water. And because of a variety of reasons, there are gaps in the law that don't cover them. And anyway, we knew that, and that there's a proposal, and there's a federal bill pending as well to close these gaps. So last summer, a remarkable thing happened. A group of pro-choice legislators in Pennsylvania got together and formed a women's health caucus. And Pennsylvania, probably most of you have heard this description, that Pennsylvania is described as Philadelphia and Pittsburgh with Alabama in between. That what's the T of the state, the center and the top tiers, are very conservative. So we may be a state because of the population centers that can elect a Democratic or a progressive president, and on occasion a governor, not currently, hopefully next time. But what we have is a state assembly and a congressional delegation that is incredibly conservative. And I can, happily not get myself in any kind of IRS problems and electoral problems. The Democrats are as bad as the Republicans outside the major population areas, with a few exceptions. So these legislators who said, came to the Law Project and said, we want to do something proactive, because for the past 3 years, they had been obsessed with finding ways to limit access to reproductive rights. In the 2011 legislative year, now, this is a legislative year 4 years after the Great Recession, where Pennsylvania is really struggling economically. There are lots of issues and problems in Pennsylvania. 1/3 of their legislative days were devoted to figuring out how to block access to abortion. And they enacted a very unnecessary, strict Ambulatory Surgical Facilities Act. We have 1,252 pages of regulations restricting access to abortion in Pennsylvania. So these legislators said, can you help us figure out something else to do? We said, oh yeah, we can do that. We actually have at least 26 recommendations from this publication. This publication that is evidence-based research. We have models from other states. Yes, we can do it. And they have formed and are developing what's called the Pennsylvania Women's Health Agenda. And what's important about this is the health agenda is looking at women's health through a very broad lens. They're looking at economic issues, pay equity issues. We're looking at wage secrecy. They understand what has been core to our mission at the Women's Law Project, which is that reproductive rights are fundamental to all other women's rights. If you cannot control your reproductive life, you're not going to be able to participate economically or socially in society. How people choose to do this themselves, of course, is their choice. We understand that. But the government's role in this is what is clearly at issue. So in order to be part of the Women's Health Caucus and to be part of the Pennsylvania Women's Agenda to support the bills that are being developed, the legislators need to be pro-choice, and they need to be pro-choice, pro-woman. And we are rolling out, or they are rolling out, legislation in 5 or 6 different pieces of legislation. And in all of those, all the rollouts, we've done one in December, another one will happen in April. There will be at least one or more very specific bills associated with reproductive rights, because part of what we're trying to do also is destigmatize abortion and contraception and put it on the continuum of women's health care. Then understand the connection between violence, because we know, for example, that pregnant women are among the most at risk for domestic violence. We know how abusers sabotage contraception. To connect these issues and to organize them in a way that the legislators can make the connections in their public proclamations about it. And we're working very hard in trying to infiltrate some of the media markets in the more conservative parts of Pennsylvania. With Kate Michelman, some of you may have known who Kate Michelman is. She was the former head of NARAL Pro-Choice America, and she was there during some of its greatest battles, a brilliant political strategist. She moved back to Pennsylvania, and she's been working with us. And we have created at the law, or reinvigorated at the Law Project, something called Women Vote PA, because as we looked at this, the health and social status of women, it was also very clear that our legislators don't do what they need to do. But it's also very clear from all of the voting data that we have is that women turn out for the important election, for the presidential elections, and sometimes the statewide elections. The off-year elections, women's participation declines significantly. And it is single women. Single women can decide virtually every race in the United States, but their voting patterns are very low. Part of the reason their voting patterns are very low, at least in Pennsylvania, is because it's so damn hard to vote in Pennsylvania. And you probably are all familiar with the recent efforts to even make voting harder in Pennsylvania. So we think it's important to, in all of the messaging we're doing, to connect issues around voting and women's health and social and economic status. And to do that in the parts of the state where we have the most conservative legislators. And we've found it, Kate and I have been writing a lot of op-ed pieces, and much to our surprise, it's been relatively easy to get them in papers like the Erie Times in York and Lebanon County, and I think it's because they're legitimately written op-eds, and no one else is writing them. So it's sort of an opportunity. It feels like it's a great opportunity for us, and it's an opportunity that I've been talking to our other public interest colleagues in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh to try to move that agenda further. So we have, I think we and other people are recognizing that it's really time to go on the offense again, that we have been defensive for too long. It's been very clear that the right wing has been brilliant in creating the juggernaut in Congress, and while all the attention is there, they have moved into the states. And, you know, in the last 3 years, 900 anti-choice pieces of legislation have been introduced in states, and a significant number have passed. You know, a number of cases are on their way to the Supreme Court, and I think most of us are really worried about where we are in the Supreme Court. So what we're hoping is the kind of zeitgeist that happened 30 and 40 years ago will happen again, and that women and progressive men, I mean, we all know that issues of contraception and access to abortion, and I didn't emphasize this enough, the continuum of women's health care also means the importance of providing support for women who want to continue their pregnancies. The pregnancy accommodation law is only one part of that, but public policy, when it comes to maternal health, when it comes to pregnancy, is terrible. Whether it's access to contraception or abortion, or whether it's the need for supports for a healthy pregnancy. And that needs to be explained more, and we just need to be more proactive and pro-woman. And, you know, I think people like Rush Limbaugh, I think statements about legitimate rape have really been very helpful in fueling our movement. I never thought I'd ever say I'm grateful to Rush Limbaugh for anything, but anyway, I feel I wouldn't do this work if I didn't have a certain amount of optimism, for sure. And I think that's true of all of my public interest colleagues in Philadelphia. But I feel a kind of energy now that I haven't in a very long time. And as you've heard, I've been doing this work for a very long time. Finally, the one additional thing I want to say, I think in my minute remaining, and maybe there's time for some conversation about this, is that I am very, very alarmed about the sexual assault on college campuses. You know, in many respects, my career began here at Penn working on those kinds of issues. We are getting complaints and information. I teach undergraduates at Penn. The stories I hear are very, very alarming. And within that, I have also, I'm not a person that spends a lot of time in cyberspace, but when I do, I am shocked at the vile, ugly commentary about women that is there. Now, those attitudes probably always existed when I came of age. I just didn't know about them. And I think that it has to have profound impact. And the work that you've done around Facebook is, you know, just starting to open the door to really recognizing that. And I think this will be a good transition to you. But those issues, I think, are new issues. They're hanging out there, and more creative, effective strategies need to be developed around them.
Thank you so much. Okay, so there's so much that you said that I noted I wanted to really talk about. Essentially, what you've described and the amazing work that you've been doing really has to do with confronting androcentrism in law and jurisprudence. And that's true everywhere, right? So we have male centrality across the board in our culture. And so when I set out to write, I promised myself that I would not write anything, and I write almost 2 pieces a week, that did not explicitly address normative bias and show how it manifests itself in culture and why women would do things that make them complicit in a culture that is misogynistic, right? If it doesn't do those 2 things, I don't publish it. And what I noticed is, because I had a media background, I started with media. I thought, okay, I'm going to deconstruct some media and really put a feminist lens on it. And very quickly, within 2 weeks, I had gone from a gap in media in terms of ownership and representation to leadership gaps, because women do not comprise more than 17% of any leadership body at all, right? In terms of big portions of our world. So corporate life, politics, religion, it doesn't matter, pick one. It's a 17% rule roughly, right? That took me to a confidence and ambition gap in boys and girls. So 6 times more boys in college say they're ready to run for office because they wake up and hey, there they are, right? Girls don't do that, and they don't because there's such a dynamic relationship between all of these siloed elements. And that got me to an empathy gap, because boys systematically have empathy beaten out of them as children. As a definition, as a criterion of masculinity, most boys have to shed their empathetic natures. And so 5-year-old boys will pick up girls' toys and boys' toys equally unless they're being watched. If they think they're being watched, they will not use girls' toys. If they think they're being watched by their fathers, especially, okay? So I find that very interesting information. There are many ways we could talk about the empathy gap. So I clicked through these things in my brain and in my writing, and what it came down to very quickly was a safety gap, right? This goes to the issue of violence against women, and reproductive rights, in my mind, are the most visible manifestation of our lack of rights to bodily integrity and autonomy. And there are many ways that we do not share equal rights in bodily integrity and autonomy. And so it really struck me that I needed to focus on this issue of the safety gap very seriously. And to explain what that is on the most basic level, um, Gallup did a poll in 2011 of 150 countries. They asked a couple of questions, one of which was, do you feel safe walking in your own neighborhood at night? In developed nations, the gaps were greatest. And that meant that, for example, in our country, I think it was 63% men and 48% women. I think that's right. But it's that distance between the numbers said yes. And we ignore that safety gap on a gendered basis, right? All of us deal with it. We don't even know we're dealing with it, right? So when my husband's driving a car and he parks somewhere far away and I say, without even thinking about it, can we park a little closer? And he says, oh my God, you're lazy. It took me a long time to think, wait a minute, I'm actually not lazy. When you are not with me, it is not safe for me to walk from my car after work. It's my habit. I make sure that I take precautions that I need to take care of, even though I know all the rape myths. That doesn't matter, right? So that's what the safety gap is. And so in terms of androcentrism, which is these normative biases, it's true in media, politics, education, religion, corporate world, law and jurisprudence, and all of that came together in this campaign, which I'd like to just describe briefly because it's so illustrative of the problems. How many people here knew anything about this Facebook rape campaign that happened last spring? Okay, so when I started writing about sexualized violence, and I write about it everywhere, so in terms of college campuses, rape in the military, rape in war, rape in homes, it's very bleak. But I write about those topics. Immediately, I was deluged by emails from women, and some men, but mainly women, some of whom said, I was 13, and I'm just going to warn you, we're talking about sexualized violence. I don't want it to be triggering for anybody. I need to kind of describe what I'm talking about, but I just wanted to let you know. You know, one woman wrote, she goes, I'm 65, I never told anyone before, but when I was 14, this happened. Another woman sent me all of her files that she'd been dealing with the police and the FBI because she was sure that her rapist was going to kill her, and if she died, she needed someone to know. Another woman sent me an actual videotape of her rape that had been shared in social media that Facebook would not take down, right? And I'm thinking, these women have nowhere to go. I mean, I work alone in my little office writing things, right? What is going on? So I sort of thought, all right, well, this is everything together, right? Because there's the media aspect. There's the tolerance for the violence that's vectored through things like rape jokes and domestic violence memes and all this graphic imagery of violence against women. And then there's the fact that social media companies like Facebook they regulate speech. They say free speech, free speech, free speech, but they're actually regulating speech every day because they have content moderators, which means they become arbiters of norms. And the norms that they use are very traditional ones because they're reflecting cultural norms, and they're kind of relying on the laws that we have and the culture we're immersed in. So after I wrote one of these things, a group of people got together and they set up a page in Facebook called Rape Book. And the purpose of Rape Book was so that people on Facebook who found or were exposed to or saw, you wouldn't believe some of it, I'm not even going to describe it, but extremely graphic violence against women, used as a joke. And when people post that stuff, Facebook would put controversial humor on it and let it go, because it was funny, right? And they set up this page so people could report it to Facebook and say, this is abusive, this is bullying, this is harassing, and their page was attacked. And so the women who were anonymous were revealed, they were doxxed, and all of their home information, photographs, the names of their children were shared publicly. They were targeted for all kinds of, I mean, they took one woman's picture, they put it on rape memes and proliferated that all over the internet. They got cannibalistic death threats, and they were working with Facebook, and Facebook's response to a lot of this was, well, those aren't legitimate threats. Their criteria for what was legitimate included that people felt safe. They forbid harassment, bullying, what they call threatening behavior, but they have to decide it's credible. And their number one priority is safety. So I went back to them as a writer and activist, and I said, okay, can we talk about this? Can you tell me, how do you define safety? How do you define credible? How do you define a threat? And it was very, very clear that as in our law, those things do not take into account the reality of women's experiences with violence. So, for example, the idea of an imminent threat is really, as we know, kind of predicated on the two men in an alley model with a gun or something. I tried to explain women experience violence as a pervasive threat. It's not an imminent threat for us. It filters through everything we do and say. And so the idea that someone had to actually be knocking on your door, threatening to rape you, which also, by the way, happens, right? Like, these guys sometimes find you, might make you feel anxious, might make you feel unsafe. And so the women's definition of harm, safety, and threat was normatively different because it was defined by their experiences. Well, that went nowhere. So I got together with two other people. One is Jacqueline Friedman at Women Action in the Media, and the other is a woman named Laura Bates who started Everyday Sexism. And we launched a campaign, and we took all these images. So for 4 months, people were sending me images, and the images were horrifying, but we cataloged them, and then we shared them with advertisers, because what happens is there's the image and there's the advertiser. And we said, do you really want to be condoning this violence against women? We wrote an open letter to Facebook. In about 5 days, we had 60,000 tweets, 15 advertisers dropped out, and Facebook actually met our demands, and we've been working with them ever since to address that. What was meaningful about this was that it was one of the first times that misogynistic speech was, they admitted, they said, we were not counting misogyny as a form of gender-based hate. And I don't know what to say about that, right? I'm like, okay. So, but this is an ongoing conversation. The reason that I focused on Facebook was because it has 1 billion users, right? And it is unto itself a proto-government, and its content regulation mirrors all of these issues we're talking about. So you had media, you had their laws, you had cultural norms, which were actually very fundamentalist belt in the end, because in Facebook, you can't, for example, show a woman's nipples, right? But you can show women in all kinds of pornographic poses with their nipples taped over, but a woman who's breastfeeding, or a woman who's protesting politically, or a woman who is using her body for artistic reasons cannot provide non-sexualized imagery that is counter speech to the sexualizing and objectifying imagery, right? And that's true in all of our media. That's true whether it's the FCC or the MPAA. It's very heteronormative. It's very very double standard, Bible beltish, slut shamey, stud baiting. It's nothing new or progressive about it, right? So I think that what was important about that was that it shifts the framing for having the conversation, and it models an alternative for other companies and other forms of activism. And I think that's very important. A lot of people think that for young people, especially, social media is this immersive experience that is dangerous or teaches them the wrong things. And my greatest concern in terms of immersive media is not social media, because kids are going to proliferate their own media in ways they couldn't before, and that gives them a lot of autonomy. My greatest concern is schools, particularly K through 12, because those are immersive media experiences that no one is paying attention to from a gender perspective in our country. So I spoke to 100 high school students yesterday, and I was talking to them about these issues, and I described all of these gaps, and I described our pay and wealth gaps, and I gave them some very granular details, and I said, so, you know, from the perspective of the way we treat childcare and the invisible labor of domestic workers and women who are providing that labor, This is a wealth transfer. It's a gender-based wealth transfer in our society between women and men, because women provide the time and the ability for the men in their lives systemically to work in an uninterrupted way, to accrue benefits that are associated with working in an uninterrupted way. I went on and on and on. And I said, okay, well, how many of you learned about the civil rights movement? And everybody put their hands up. I said, how many of you learned about the history of women's rights movements in this country? 3 people put up their hands, and one was the women's studies teacher. Okay? So my response to that was that they were only half educated, and that it was an institutional failure in every single one of our schools, that they didn't have this information at their fingertips. And then a young boy looked at me after I described all of this, and I pack all of my writing with statistics because, frankly, I don't really want to argue with idiots. I want them to argue with the information. And he says to me, well, isn't motherhood the most important job in the world? And I had like 6 thoughts immediately. And the first one was, is he really trying to explain the value of motherhood to me? And I didn't say it out loud. And then I thought, maybe he doesn't think I understand economics. And then I thought, maybe he loves his mother and she's done a really fantastic job and he thinks I'm maligning her work and his father's labor. And then I thought, no, he's just really trying to explain to me that motherhood's the most important job in the world, because that's what he's been told. So I said, you know, we really love motherhood. We just can't stand mothers. Like, we really have no tolerance for mothers' needs in society. And then I described androcentrism in the law in very great detail.
That was beautiful.
But, you know, that was an hour with these kids. And what I said after to the teachers was, that's great, I'm happy, because it was a good discussion, and we had the discussion, but I'm much more concerned with the follow-up conversation. And that's true all the time, you know. And the other thing is, for these kids, as I said to them at the beginning, and this, I'm focusing on them because they're exposed to everything we're talking about, right? So the media, immersive media environment, they're in it. The political system, whether they know it or not yet, they are in it. They benefit from it or they don't. They may not be politically conscious, but that's really quite irrelevant in terms of their actions. But what was amazing to me was that, I said to them, you need to understand, and there were 70% of the room was boys, because I had named the presentation Everyday Sexism in the End of Men, because end of men narratives are a prevailing theme in backlash, and we're having one now, right? So we have a lot of end of menness running around. And I wanted to make the point that I didn't think that was really a worry right now. And I think I made it, but what I said to them is, you need to be able to separate your individual experiences from the systems that we all operate in. And so when I talk about history, race, class, ethnicity, and gender, I am not trying to say, you are a white boy and you are evil. That is not the point of this conversation. What I'm trying to say is you get to pick whether you personally are going to contribute to a more just world or not. And if you choose not to, then you are doing definitive harm. And I just don't think children are getting that message necessarily. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that I had some notes just really responding to what you were saying. I did ask them this because I thought it was important, because violence is so central to this in my mind. I said, how many of you, I said, I'm not going to use any language. I like cursing, and I take it out of my writing. So usually I write something and it's filled with obscenities, and then I take them all out. And I said this to them because I said, I'm not going to use any language that you yourselves haven't been exposed to otherwise. How many of you have seen a Will Ferrell movie or a Judd Apatow movie or, and they all put up their hands. I said, okay, good, then we're good. You've all heard rape jokes. So if I talk to you about actual rape, I will not be introducing new information, right? And I kind of saw this freeze. And so we talked about that. And the example on this sheet from the Daily Pennsylvanian is one of way too many, right? So I wrote something 2 weeks ago, and it was called, "Why Are So Many Boys Leaving High School Thinking Rape is Funny?" And it is such a horrifying litany of idiocy that I didn't even know where to begin when I started looking at that. And it's because it's okay. It's because, we're worried about rape on college campuses. It's too late by the time we're worried about rape on college campuses. It really is. And the example I gave them was actually Catholic school uniform enforcement, right? Because we've got dress codes, and dress codes are one of the most kind of subtly harmful things I can imagine in certain environments, because I'll give you an example. In my children's school, they had a problem with the girls' uniform skirts being too short. So they took all the girls in a room and they said, "You're distracting the boys." It is 2014, and they said those words, right? And so my daughter, one of whom is 14, she stood up and she said, "Well, I don't really know why you've separated us, boys and girls. And if the boys are distracted, that's not really my problem. You need to be talking to them." And no one listened to her, right? So she finished speaking, and they took a girl up on stage and they drew on her leg to show where the skirt should be. And so that night I sent a 13-page email. And I explained that taking her body without her consent and putting her on stage and drawing on it and making a joke of it actually did several bad things. One was that they confused acquiescence with consent. They abused their power in doing so. They trivialized it by making it funny. And all of that combined was just excellent rape tolerance information they had just passed along. Because after a girl goes through 6 or 7 years of having those things happen and having people with authority do those things, and she gets to college and there's a bigger boy who's got status, because he always has more status, and he's physically using her body in a way she might not want, she's been pretty well conditioned by her teachers and administrators to go right along with that. And that didn't really go over so well in terms of the school's response, which was nothing, right? So I just think that while the situation on college campuses is horrible, it's just too late. It really is. It's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And so the norms that we really need to challenge are the norms in the education system prior to that. So I write a lot about those things. And I write a lot about them, hopefully I don't write for the parents of 11-year-olds about rape culture using the language of rape culture, because that doesn't make any sense. You really have to talk to people about situations in ways that make sense for them. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Oh, and the last part about that is I think that's really a question of social justice in the classroom. And so I try very hard to be involved. There's a movement of social justice in the classroom, and I think it's important.
Thank you to both the panelists. And we're going to have a question and answer session now. And I would just like to push you slightly to certainly ask any questions you might have about how you could be involved in any of the campaigns or movements about which my panelists are speaking, and I know that they would be thrilled to talk to you about that. So we're going to have microphones going around the room. If you'll just raise your hand if you have a question. I think Kimberly has one here.
we have a lot of laws. We come from Tennessee, and we have a lot of laws there, especially regarding social media and what imagery is shown there, and especially with the vulgarity and the explicit and illicit pictures of minors. It is said as it's child pornography, which is a pretty much standard around the country. What are the laws here that depict or that help to protect people from rape pictures and rape videos and the violence? Is there not anything that is going to help legally stop this? I mean, because it just seems like I think there's an absence of legislation or activism that's to stop.
Well, actually, part of the Pennsylvania Women's Health Agenda is a bill that is the revenge porn bill. That it's passed the Judiciary Committee, and I should also say it's gotten approval from the ACLU. And it bans publishing any photo or video identifying another person who is naked or engaging in a sexual act without that person's consent. May not be as much as we want, but it's the first step. And it's passed the Senate Judiciary Committee, which actually kind of surprised me.
Revenge, does everyone know what revenge porn is? Okay.
I bet there's a generation
Okay,
divide on
does
that.
anybody, I'm just going to ask, does anybody not know what revenge porn is?
You could go ahead and define it.
Okay, so revenge porn is when someone uses an intimate photograph without permission, but there are websites set up where primarily men, overwhelmingly men, take these photographs and share them, right? So one man in Maryland not only shared it, it was his ex-wife, he pretended to be her posting it, saying, I would really love to be raped and here's my address. So rapists showed up at her house, right? And so that's kind of one version of revenge porn, but revenge porn exists on a spectrum, and the spectrum goes from, you know, young girls who, they're young, they don't even have prefrontal lobes, right? They're like taking photographs because they can do it, and it's easy, and they've been growing up with these boys, and they've been playing sports with them, and they've been told they're equal, and the boys say, oh, I dare you to take off your shirt, and the girl goes, ah! And then next thing she knows, 50,000 people have seen her flash, right? That happened in Alexandria, Virginia, again, it happens regularly, but last spring, and she was in a school, this child, and this is exactly the situation. These people had gone to school together, they knew each other, they were really good friends. She did this, the boys shared it with their lacrosse team, the lacrosse team shared it with the school. The administrators of the school called her in and said, what are you going to do to address the harm you did to boys? And she was like, what? And they said, you traumatized them. And it was child pornography. And they kicked her out of school. The boys were not penalized in any way. Her biggest concern when they first called her into the office was that she had gotten these young men who were athletes into trouble. Okay? Now, everything I just described is par for the course when it comes to the use of photography, because we don't respect consent to begin with. The idea that you would have to get a girl's consent to use her photograph, you might as well be speaking in Martian, okay? So I have people ask me questions. I have young men ask me questions like, well, really, what's the difference between my forwarding a picture of a girl and forwarding a picture of a toaster? And there's no response you can give a 16-year-old other than, well, in the beginning there was darkness. Right? Because where are you going to start with this question? And so I just think that the revenge porn laws, New Jersey, California, have passed them. There are two scholars I strongly urge you to look at their work. One is named Danielle Citron, and the other one is Marianne Franks. And Danielle's about to come out with a book called Hate 2.0, and Marianne and she both write for concurring opinions about these topics. They're terrific. But yeah, I mean, that issue of consent is big. So that, for example, again, Facebook, Twitter, all of these places, when a girl sees her photograph being used that way and she says, can you take it down? It's causing me stress, it's causing me anxiety, I'm mortified, I'm being bullied. And the company says, not our problem. You know, Communications Decency Act, Clause 230, not my thing. Doesn't have anything to do with me, I'm not responsible, right? So we're pushing them to use consent as a criterion for establishing whether or not something constitutes legitimate bullying, right? You have to have the person's consent. That is a gigantic, gigantic issue. But it's across the board because that's just proto-behavior for actually getting someone's consent, right?
Do we have one back here as well?
Hi. My question is in regards to, sorry, I'm looking at my notes. The access to reproductive rights. Carol, you suggested that we go on the offensive when it comes to trap legislation, but I'm wondering how one actually goes on the offensive when it comes to bills like the Senate Bill 732, which passed in 2011 and is now Act 122, that required unnecessary measures for abortion clinics in Pennsylvania, effectively shutting down most of them.
No, it did not shut down most of them, I'm happy to say.
Well-
It shut down because we represented them. All of the Planned Parenthood clinics remained open, and all of the National Abortion Federation clinics remained open. Several clinics did shut down, so I'm not saying they didn't. Some of them were small doctors' practices.
Right.
Now, it was very hard to keep them open, let me tell you.
Oh, I was working actually for Planned Parenthood during that summer of 2011, so I was in the campaign, but I'm wondering how you combat and how you're offensive against misinformation, which is what these bills were working with.
Well, the way you combat it, I mean, I think the only way we can combat that is at the ballot, at the voting booth. We've got to vote these people out of office.
And you have to run.
And yes, we need more people running. You know, it's the Pennsylvania dilemma. You know, it was the Abortion Control Act. You know, there's been generation after generation for many years. Pennsylvania led the nation in anti-choice legislation. We were to the Supreme Court twice on the Pennsylvania Abortion Control Act. So, you know, I think it's a long-term strategy. I don't think it's a short-term strategy. But I also have to tell you that progressive foundations have never invested in state-based strategies.
Right.
We have no money to do any of this work. To the extent that there is any funding around women's rights issues, it only goes to national organizations. It doesn't trickle down to people who are working in the states. There are only 5 state-based women's law projects in the country, and we're the biggest of them. So there's been no investment because women have been taken for granted. They've been taken for granted because women are more likely to vote progressively, to vote liberally, and that's part of the reason there is a strategy, because everyone knows if all those single women who don't vote did vote, our legislative bodies would change dramatically. I mean, there's no doubt in my mind that is what is the right-wing strategy and how they are moving into the states, and they're using the most controversial issue. They're using abortion as the issue as the anchor to keep the legislators tied up, to keep the, you know, God knows the Catholic Conference is very busy. It's one of our strongest lobbies in Pennsylvania. So it, you know, and it's an issue, you know, that on which a lot of people have different moral positions, to be sure. And it's the issue that, of course, affects all the rest of our issues. So I think there's, you know, the long-run strategy, the only one that I can think of, because we have done everything we can legally to keep abortion clinics open, to keep them safe in Pennsylvania. You know, we have a buffer zone as a statewide buffer zone piece of legislation. We have 2 of them we have one in Pittsburgh, one in Harrisburg. We have very strong police protection in Philadelphia, But if the statewide buffer zone doesn't pass, I feel quite confident we'll pass one here in Philadelphia. But we've got to have different legislative bodies. We need better people running for office, and we need more people voting. We need more progressive women and men voting, and we've got to mobilize and educate that group of people.
Can I add one thing to that, just very quickly?
Yeah, go ahead.
I think I serve on the board of an organization called Emerge that trains Democratic women for office, and also on the advisory committee for something called Women in Secularism. And we have the most religious country in the industrialized world. And secularism has been conflated with atheism, which is very disturbing to people. And secularism and atheism are two very different things. Women cannot afford not to be religious, right? Because religion provides them with a social safety net, particularly African American women, that is not available in society in general, right? So I think it's really important for women who have the ability to be outspoken about secularism, whether they are religious or not. The reason we have this massive proliferation of religion in our country is because we're a secular country. It gave religions the freedom to thrive in a way that didn't exist in Europe, right? But when you look transnationally, it's very clear that the countries with the highest gender equity indices are those that are the most secular. And we are losing an opportunity by allowing atheism and secularism to be misrepresented, and by not making the connections between economic justice, religious freedom, and social justice at large, including reproductive justice. So they're not, I think a lot of people feel disempowered, but the truth of the matter is a lot of people who are non-believers don't feel comfortable saying that. And so we privilege religion in discourse, in private discourse, and in media discourse. So when I write that I think the Pope should be pulled up in front of the Court of Human Rights because tens of thousands of women die every year because they're not getting health care, I don't think that's shocking news, right? Because that's what's happening. But people, even if they believe it, don't feel comfortable saying that. And I think we need to get past that boundary where we can actually talk honestly about subjects that are difficult. That's hard for us.
I think we have one in the middle here.
Hi, Carol. I'm basically a contemporary of yours. So me and a lot of women I know are in that caregiving role, at least, on a partial basis. And one thing that does not affect me personally, but it certainly affects me through many of these, primarily women, is a real concern about the Family Medical Leave Act. And I sort of am curious to know if the Law Project gets complaints or has issues with that. Anecdotally, the general concern I hear is that these women are tremendously pressed, by being a caregiver. Usually it's an elderly mom, father, but it might be, another relative or friend. And they, because of the economy these days, and the problem that if you're over a certain age and leave the workforce, are you ever coming back? And so what I hear is just a huge fear of, well, I know it's my legal right to use the Family Medical Leave Act, but I'm just too afraid to even, quote, try that, end quote. Could you speak to that?
Well, actually, we haven't had those kinds of complaints. That doesn't mean they're not there. And remember, the Family Medical Leave Act, it's unpaid leave. So for so many people, they can't use it. And that's right. And well, it depends on the numbers of hours and all of that. Where we've seen it being used most harmfully is forcing pregnant women out early. That the limited accommodation that they need for the last months of pregnancy, they don't make for them, and they're not required to because they're not doing it for other employees. So they push them out of the labor force early. By the time they have delivered, when they would want to be using their family and medical leave, they are out of it, and they're out of a job, and they're out of health care. So the family medical leave is so inadequate because it's unpaid, in Western countries, once again, we're at the bottom of the heap here because we do not value, we do not value caretaking. We do not value what you said about the mothers is perfect. What people valorize and glamorize motherhood, but don't like mothers and don't provide support at either end of these continuum. And I think we all see it in our workplaces. I know in my workplace, on one hand, young women with young children, and on the other hand, women who are dealing with their elderly parents or in-laws or other relatives and need to be available. And the health consequences of that we found when we did the research for Through the Lens of Equality was really staggering. It's one of the most depressing parts of that study for us.
This question of care, though, your question about care, it's interesting because, again, when I was talking to these kids, only boys asked questions, and one boy, he wasn't really asking a question. He basically said, well, I don't really see why pregnant women should get paid if they're not able to do the work. And they're just going to have babies, and then they've got to go take care of them. And I said, why? And he just kind of looked at me, and I said, why do you think they have to go and take care of them? Because I don't really see why dads can't take care of them. Like, I don't understand your question. And it had, I don't think, occurred to him that if there was a dad around, the dad could do that. And I said, the problem is that regardless, your conception of care is feminized. What we need is for everybody to mother, because the way we define caring is synonymous with mothering, and we have to not do that. And so we're one of 3 countries in the world. One, I think, is Papua New Guinea, and maybe the other one is Togo, that does not provide paid maternal leave. I'm personally not going for paid maternal leave. I'm going for paid, non-stigmatized parental leave.
That's right.
Okay? That's a different thing. And I think that taking the maternal leave route is like baby talk for children. I'm like, why would you do that? You then have to teach them real talk, right? So I think that it starts super early again. Those ideas about gender and gender roles, they start with things like chores. Boys do 2 hours less chores in a house. They get paid 10% more for those chores, and the chores are entirely gendered the way they were 60 years ago. Girls are folding laundry and vacuuming and doing the dishes, and boys are stacking wood and mowing lawns and cleaning cars. And we just have to stop that.
I think we have time for one last question here, and then we're going to move on.
Good morning. I wanted to introduce myself. My name is Beth Olenoff, and I work at on a project to increase the amount of women in American history that's taught in K-12 and outside the classroom as well. It's one of the shocking things. There's a huge gender gap in our teaching of American history, and in our opinion, my organization is called Vision 2020. In our opinion, this is one of the factors that leads to all of these other things. The gender gap in pay equity and leadership, in perceptions of violence and rape, et cetera, et cetera. How did you get in front of those students yesterday, and do you have any thoughts and suggestions for how to get these important issues in front of young people?
Well, first of all, I don't think it will ever happen until parents advocate for change, because there are great teachers that are talking about these things, but it's not systematized, right? And that's the problem. So I have twins. 1 year, one can have a great teacher, and that same year, the other one can have a teacher who doesn't know the end of the pencil from the other, right? But we need institutions to take responsibility for this. So I personally, as a parent and a writer and an activist, have not found many things. I found them in other countries. And so the social justice in the classroom movement that I talked about is new. It's just starting. It involves teachers and administrators. I personally am trying to organize a parental advocacy movement, but I don't have a lot of time, really. However, I think it takes things like social contracts in schools, of which I've written one based on things I've seen in other countries that say that, this is our commitment to this issue, and then it becomes an audit and checklist that people can use, because people shouldn't have to recreate the wheel every time. I mean, ideally, I would like to see parents get online, download the audit, figure out what's going on in their schools, approach the administration with a contract or some version of the contract, and hold them accountable for